Cult of the Lamb has this game called Knucklebones, where you can play against one of 4 characters. And while I don't know that much about the game itself, Wikipedia says that early versions of the game used a specific bone in the ankle of a sheep. So the idea that the lamb in Cult of the Lamb is playing with sheep bones is a little unnerving, if I'm being honest. But I guess it tracks for the game. Welcome to Mindfork. A new update for Cult of the Lamb came out this week, which got me to play the game again. One of my friends had told me about it pre-release about a year ago, so I was excited to see something relatively new. After playing for a few hours, I came to understand 3 things. 1. Making demons turns the difficulty way down, something that I desperately needed. 2. Axes are better than swords, fight me on that. And 3. Creating a cult is surprisingly easy. I've always been intrigued by the idea of cults. They're horrible, don't get me wrong, but the idea that one man can control such a large number of people and destroy their lives in the meantime is something straight out of a supernatural thriller, a true demonic possession. And so I thought, well, how does Cult of the Lamb get away with brainwashing? Surely it's not so easy to quote-unquote re-educate someone into thinking how you want, and especially not in an environment like that, right? Well, let's get into it. The word brainwashing was first used by Edward Hunter in the 1950s. He had written various articles about the People's Republic of China's program to re-educate the masses in communist ideology. And with this, the fear of mind control and communism began to grow within the American public. Then the Korean War happened, and a few years into it, American prisoners of war began to confess to crimes that they had no part in. 7,200 prisoners of war and 5,000 of them were doing something similar. Petitions to stop the war or similar false admissions. Nobody knew why they were doing this, and so the idea of brainwashing grew even stronger. I'm dramatizing a little, but that's basically where it started. While not entirely relevant to Cult of the Lamb, cults in general use the ideas found in these events to not only bring in new followers, but keep them. The basis of cult indoctrination, brainwashing, is to find vulnerable people, not people that are weak, but those who have gone through hardships and are looking for peace of mind, and promise them something better. These promises of freedom and peace are usually enough for a lot of people, because nobody wants to be hurt and alone, right? Cults give you love and community, or so they would have you believe. We see that the cultists in Cult of the Lamb behave in a very timid and frankly vulnerable way when they're first introduced to your circle. Then, once you've given them a new identity, along with some fancy new clothes, they flourish and take on a more confident demeanour. It's a similar thing in real life. What about when you're actually in a cult? How do they get you to stay? Well, a scientist called Robert J. Lifton can answer for us. Several years after the Korean War had ended, Lifton wrote one of the most forefront books on brainwashing. You'll probably have heard of it if you know anything about the subject. Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, which goes through interviews with some of the prisoners of war mentioned before, and also goes through the step-by-step process of thought reform. So, how did they do it? Well, it starts with an assault on identity. You are a bad person. How dare you do those horrible things? Do you know how much pain you've caused to the people around you? You should be ashamed. Why didn't the people around you stop you from doing those things? They must be bad people too. Tell me why they let you do it. Would you like a drink of water? Are you ready to talk about why you did those things? I know you're confused, and that's okay. You've lived a life of badness because the ideology you lived under is bad. You were just taught wrong, right? It's your teachers and the ideology that's more at fault. Tell me about the worst things you've done while under this ideology. What my people believe in is far kinder than that evil ideology you used to believe in. We will always welcome newcomers to our faith. We have a few rituals we need you to complete in order to join our harmonious land, about accepting the new ideology fully and completely, swearing allegiance to us. We should note though that this would take place in an isolated environment where all typical social references are unavailable, a bit like the cult grounds that you take over. You would also need to cloud your subject's mind by controlling their sleep, food, drink, daily necessities, and really kind of any movement in general, a bit like the interaction wheel. There should also be a constant threat of physical harm, which, if you've ever been in that kind of scenario, impairs your ability to think properly. A bit like being sacrificed, taking on the sins of your peers, eating a bowl of poop, cannibalism, turning into a demon would probably hurt too, and a bunch of other ways to straight up torture your cultist members. So surprisingly, Cult of the Lamb is pretty onto it when considering the mechanics of cult indoctrination. There definitely are other factors to consider when talking about brainwashing too though. Remember how I mentioned that the public went into a bit of a downward spiral after word of mind controls started getting thrown out? Well, after the Korean War, the US government got nervous about the idea of brainwashing and decided to go all in on a new project to combat it. MK Ultra. I would be very surprised if you hadn't heard of it, though no one would blame you if you hadn't. It was basically just brainwashing through drugs and psychological torture. There's a lot of pretty graphic details there, so if you want to dig deeper, I'd do that in your own time if you're curious. But to summarize, it wasn't very promising. It didn't really amount to much, since not a lot of data was being collected. I mean, these guys weren't scientists, after all. And a little while later, drug experimentation by the CIA was officially cancelled by Congress in the 1970s. So much for that. Cult of the Lamb replicates this too, to a much lesser degree, finding Sozo, a specialist in mushroom research and a leader of a small mushroom cult. If you complete his quest, he'll teach you how to perform the brainwashing ritual. I know, right? Who would have thought? If you perform the ritual, the Lamb gives every cultist a handful of mushrooms for them to consume. Hallucinogenic mushrooms. But that's about it. Of course, there are some people who are inclined to be more resistant to brainwashing, but that remains to be seen since it's pretty difficult to study how it works. There's one pretty big reason why we can't, and that's because it's an insane violation of ethics, since, as I said before, complete control over the, well, victim is necessary. So, is the brainwashing in Cult of the Lamb realistic? Somewhat? Sure. There's definitely other factors to consider, but I feel pretty comfortable leaving it at that. If you enjoyed the video, subscribe. Starting today, I'll be releasing on a weekly basis, so stay tuned for the ride. Thanks for being here.